We've got a bit of breaking news that has just crossed. Lord Tebbit has died aged 94. That's according to the PA news agency. His son told PA that he died peacefully at home.
Yeah, Lord Tebbit was an influential figure in the Thatcher government, from a working class background in Essex to a career as an airline pilot. Norman Tebbit, he reached the heights of the Conservative Party, of course, in the 1980s, and he served as an employment secretary, also party chairman too. And during his time in government, he was one of the high-profile victims of the IRA's bombing at the Grand Hotel. This was in Brighton, and his wife was paralysed during that time too, for the rest of her life. But he was known for his prominence and his staunch reaction to riots during Margaret Thatcher's early years. And he was quoted at one conference as telling those in attendance that his father didn't riot. When he didn't have a job, he got on his bike and looked for work. And he stepped down from politics around 3 years ago.
He, of course, as you pointed out there, Leah, and Mari's here to discuss his legacy as well, is perhaps best remembered for the way he supported his wife as well. As Mari said, he was affected by the bomb at the Grand Hotel in Brighton in 1984. His wife, Margaret, was left permanently disabled, and that is why he stepped down early, I guess you'd say, or not early, but in the middle of the Thatcher years at the 1987 election to care for his wife off the back of a bombing that I guess him and his wife were only affected by because of his role in politics.
Yeah, I mean, he was known to be one of those politicians who really took on the trade unions and wanted to an extent, to kind of dismantle some of their power, let's say. And we've actually just got a statement from his son that's been coming through from the Press Association that said at 11:15 p.m. on the 7th of July 2025, Lord Tebbit died peacefully at home, aged 94. His family asked that their privacy is respected at this time, and a further statement regarding funeral arrangements will be made in due course. I think, depending on, your political beliefs, to an extent, putting those aside, he was a titan of his age. He was an incredibly influential, high-profile politician during Margaret Thatcher's time as Prime Minister. He changed, to an extent, the course of history. He was also, as Leah was outlining, party chairman in the Conservative Party at one point, and therefore clearly shaped the direction and the legacy of the Conservative Party as it is today as well. And I think that interesting analogy around on your bike. So he was known for this phrase, on your bike, despite the fact that he never used that phrase, but it was in reference to exactly what, Leah, you were talking about, which is that he said that when his father was unemployed and looking for work, he didn't riot, he got on his bike and went and tried to find work. And he was often criticised, perhaps, for being unsympathetic at times to some of those rioters and workers and perhaps their predicament and their experiences, but he was known as a free marketeer, and he believed in those political beliefs and that ideology, through and through to his DNA to an extent.
Let's just remind you of the news that has broken in the last few minutes that Lord Tebbit has died. The former Conservative Party grandee. He was chairman of the Conservative Party in the 1985 to 87. He was, before that, the Minister of State for Trade and Industry, and before that, the Secretary of State for Employment in the early 80s. Of course, departments that were hugely consequential in the Thatcher government at a time when she took over, of course, following the economic declines of the 70s, and put through all sorts of industrial policies that divided opinion greatly. As we also mentioned, he is well known for the fact that he was affected by the bomb in Brighton, the Grand Hotel, in 1984 that was targeting Margaret Thatcher. But Tebbit was injured and his wife was left permanently disabled from that explosion and he stepped down from cabinet at the 1987 election because of that. Remained a big figure in the Conservative Party, though, ever since, a grandee, of course, and was ennobled as Lord Tebbit in the years that followed.
Yeah, he had a seat in the House of Lords after stepping down as an MP. That was in 1992. But I suppose his childhood and those early experiences really shaped who he was. He was born in 1931 in Ponders End in Middlesex, and this was at the height of the Great Depression. He went to the local grammar school. Later in life, he had his first job actually at the Financial Times, and that's when he first clashed, I suppose, with the unions to try and break that power of a closed shop. He later, after national service, he became an RAF pilot, so a really rich and illustrious career, and then later turning to politics, and he was the first Conservative MP for Epping. This was in the 1970s, and then 4 years later for Chinkford in Essex. So a huge career, and as Mari outlined, had huge impact at quite a pivotal point in British politics, Mari.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's some amazing anecdotes here from his time in office. And I think something that really stands out to me in terms of his background and his working class background. So it's really interesting. He says he was cut from a very different cloth. And Harold Macmillan remarked at one point saying, "I heard a cap on the radio this morning talking with a Cockney accent. They tell me he is one of Her Majesty's ministers." And that was Norman Tebbit. And it just shows you how, to an extent, he was breaking down barriers, perhaps in terms of his own background, coming into the Conservative Party and being so high profile and powerful, and actually kind of dispelling perhaps some of those myths that the Conservative Party was only for a particular type of person or somebody from a particular background. And clearly he was evidence front and centre in Margaret Thatcher's government that was no longer the case, and that actually you could come from a humble background, you could have an accent or a regional accent and still make it to the top of government in a Conservative Party, which again was often associated with being elitist and perhaps wealthy individuals and so forth.
We're able to bring in now political commentator Adam Bolton, who joins us to weigh in. And Adam, Norman Tebbit, a giant figure of the Conservative Party, a giant figure of British politics. Sorry, we've now got the connection with Adam. Adam, great to have you with us. We're just reflecting on the giant stature of Norman Tebbit in British politics. I don't think the connection is actually working at the moment with Adam Bolton yet. We'll bring in... Oh, there he is. Adam, just great to have you with us. And we were just reflecting on the giant stature of Lord Tebbit in British politics.
Yeah, I think that's certainly right. Other than Margaret Thatcher, he probably was the leading Conservative politician of the Thatcher era as far as supporting Margaret Thatcher was concerned. Of course, Michael Heseltine became the main thorn in her side, and he was later Deputy Prime Minister. I think, you know, what Norman Tebbit represented was the fact that he was a Thatcherite. He was someone who didn't like the European Union. He was someone who didn't like big government. And who famously was always associated with that catchphrase of "on your bike" for unemployed workers. What he actually said was that his father got on his bike and found work. He didn't actually tell workers directly to get on their bikes, but that was always associated with him. Then, of course, he was one of the major victims of the Brighton bomb. He was permanently injured, but his wife, Margaret, who died a year or so ago, she was crippled and in a wheelchair for the rest of her life, something Norman Tebbit, of course, felt very bitterly about, and he spent a lot of time looking after her. But even after that tragedy in 1984, he went on to be the Conservative Party chairman and the architect of Mrs. Thatcher's third election victory in 1987. Again, that was somewhat controversial. He was the party chairman, but was considered to be very abrasive. And actually, they had a thing called Wobbly Thursday, where they thought that they might be about to lose that election. And Lord Hunt was brought in, Lord Young was brought in as a co-chairman to kind of turn the campaign around. Of course, it went on, and Margaret Thatcher won the 1987 election, her third election victory fairly comprehensively. So I think the other thing about Norman Tebbit was he was a character. He wasn't afraid to say what he thought. He got also into some hot water when he talked about the so-called cricket test with reference to immigrants from around the former British Empire and colonies, saying, you know, if you want to be integrated into British society, you should be supporting England rather than India or Bangladesh or Pakistan. And again, some people saw that as being a racist statement. I mean, the thing about Norman Tebbit was he was very good company. He worked for a long time, actually, at the start of Sky and Sky News. He and the Labour politician Austin Mitchell presented a programme together called Target, where they supposedly were attacking a politician from left and right. One of the problems, though, was that the big issue of the day was Britain's membership of the European Union, and both Austin Mitchell and Norman Tebbit were against membership of the European Union. So sometimes there wasn't that much tension between them.
It sounds like a great programme. I want to go back and watch it, Adam. And obviously, you were central, as you were for many decades, to Sky News at that point, and no doubt got to spend quite a lot of time with him in those roles, but also other roles off camera. Talk to us a little bit about that, because sometimes people can form an image of someone who's quite abrasive on some policy areas, as you've already outlined, as assuming they might be abrasive off camera. Did that apply to Lord Tebbit?
Well, there was always an element of danger about him. You thought that you might say something which could offend him, and he would certainly bite back if he disagreed with you. But he was actually very genial company. I mean, I often surprise people by saying that if you had to spend an evening in the pub or having dinner with a politician, Norman Tebbit would be good company and friendly and warm company, whereas perhaps some of the people more admired centrist politicians, you know, one thinks of Roy Jenkins, for example. Late Roy Jenkins could be quite pompous and quite hard work. Certainly Norman Tebbit wasn't pompous. And of course, he had a very interesting life history, coming from a working class background, actually early on joining a trade union, SOGAT, which was one of the newspaper unions, which turned him forever against the cold shop. And he, you know, his big legislative reforms were trade union reforms. Then he went into the RAF and was a jet pilot. And from there, he went into BOAC, as it then was, the main British overseas airline. And so, you know, he wasn't just someone who had gone to Oxford, been a special advisor at Westminster and climbed up the ladder to get into government like so many politicians today. He was someone who really had lived life and had a life outside of Westminster. And that, I think, gave him a quality which helped him to connect, not just personally, if you're having a drink with him, but also with many in the general public as well.
Adam, in terms of where he stood within the sort of Thatcher years more broadly, and in terms of standing by Thatcher's side, we often reflect on those that were great allies of hers until they suddenly weren't at the end of her 10-plus year reign. Where did he stand? Was he always a very close ally of hers, or did he also pivot in the later years?
No, he certainly didn't pivot away from supporting her. I think, you know, he read the political mood, and I think he knew that it would be an uphill fight to keep her in office. But he was absolutely a Thatcher loyalist to the end. And of course, he took the decision to stand down from the House of Commons in the 1992 election, the election which John Major fought once Mrs. Thatcher had been deposed as Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party. And I mean, he wasn't one of those who was constantly sniping from the sidelines. He didn't seek to attack the Conservatives after he had left office. But at the same time, if asked, he made it pretty clear that he wasn't necessarily very impressed with the way things were going.
We just had a statement, Adam, from Kemi Badenoch, of course, the Conservative Party leader. Mari, what has she been saying about Lord Tebbit?
Yeah, so Kemi Badenoch has just done a tweet in reaction to Norman Tebbit's death. And let me read it to you now. So she's talked about how he was a titan, and she said, our Conservative family mourns... sorry, this is loading. A Conservative mourns the loss of Lord Tebbit today, and I say my sincerest condolences to his loved ones. Norman Tebbit was an icon in British politics, and his death will cause sadness across the political spectrum. He was one of the leading exponents of the philosophy we now know as Thatcherism, and his unstinting service in the pursuit of improving our country should be held up as an inspiration for all Conservatives. As a minister in Mrs. Thatcher's administration, he was one of the main agents of the transformation of our country, notably in taming the trade unions. But to many of us, it was the stoicism and courage he showed in the face of terrorism which inspired us as he rebuilt his political career after suffering terrible injuries in Brighton, and cared selflessly for his wife, Margaret, who was gravely disabled in the bombing. A reminder that he was first and foremost a family man who always held true to his principles. She then ends by saying he never buckled under pressure and he never compromised. Our nation has lost one of its very best today, and I speak for all the Conservative family and beyond in recognising Lord Tebbit's enormous intellect and profound sense of duty to his country. May he rest in peace.
And a further statement coming through, Leah, from a former Tory leader, in David Davis.
Yeah, David Davis.
Oh, no, not quite Tory. Sorry, I'm getting confused. Tory Grandee.
Yes, David Davis. And he's just saying this morning, Norman was a great working class Tory, always ready to challenge establishment, conventional wisdom for the bogus nonsense it often was. He was a great friend of Thatcher. He had to deal with the agony that the IRA visited on him and his wife, and he did so with characteristic, unflinching courage. He was a great man.
Adam's still with us to discuss this. Really interesting, Adam, that both David Davis and Kemi Badenoch focusing on that working class Tory aspect.
Yeah, perhaps still exceptional when one thinks of grandees who've led the party, like the very privileged David Cameron, quite recently, for example, although, of course, there have always been other working class Conservatives like John Major who got there. But it did give the Conservative Party a view of the world, outside of Clubland, if you like, in the West End of London. And what I think we heard there from Kemi Badenoch and also from David Davis is a sense that if you're talking about the direction of the Conservative Party, Norman Tebbit has had the last laugh, that the Conservative Party today is Tebbitite in terms of its attitudes towards Europe, towards trade unions, towards a small state and low taxation, in a way that perhaps through the years of its leadership from John Major through to David Cameron, it wasn't. So in that sense, as a Conservative politician, given the state of the party now, he might feel that he's been vindicated. Of course, that doesn't necessarily reflect itself in the low level of popularity across the whole electorate that the Conservatives are now suffering.
Again, I guess it's interesting to reflect on how politics changes, Adam, and the long-term commitment, not just to his party that he showed, but to the idea of public service and not the kind of come in, come out mindset that perhaps applies more to politics today?
Yeah, I think that's perhaps true, but it's also worth noting that basically Norman Tebbit retired from frontline politics in 1992, so we've had 30 years since where he enjoyed shooting, for example, but also felt that he had to devote more time to his wife following her crippling in the Brighton bomb. So. Again, I think that shows that he wasn't someone for whom, politics was everything. He didn't die in harness as a former politician. He carried on with his own life and his own friends and retired to the country. So yes, he had a sense of public service, but I think he also felt that once he got Mrs. Thatcher re-elected and once the party rejected her, that he'd done that and he would move on to broader things. So in that sense, he's someone, he's had a long life, but he did have a hinterland of other interests. I mean, it wasn't an accident, for example, that he talked about the cricket test. He liked sport, he liked cricket, he liked following those things. So, I think people see him as a hard man. I mean, back in the old days, that puppet show Spitting Image used to show him in a leather jacket with a sort of bicycle chain as a kind of hoodlum ready to beat things up. Actually, Norman Tebbit was a much broader and more rounded person than, that slightly thuggish image might have given you the impression.
Just remind us, Leah, as well, this news crossed, 20, 30 minutes ago.
Yeah, just a statement was released earlier this morning from Lord Tebbit's son, William, saying that at 11:15 p.m. on the 7th of July 2025, Lord Tebbit died peacefully at home. He was 94 years old, and the family asking for privacy at the moment, at this time, as you'd imagine, and there'll be more details on funeral arrangements which will be made in due course.
Mari, we've heard from a number of high-profile Tories, the current leader, Kemi Badenoch, of course, saying he was an icon in British politics.
Yeah, exactly. She's talked about how the Conservative family is mourning the loss. She said he was an icon in British politics and his death will cause sadness across the political spectrum. And she talks about how he was one of the leading exponents of the philosophy we now know as Thatcherism, in terms of just how pivotal he was in the architecture of that political belief system now. And she said that he was one of the main agents of transformation of the UK, especially around taming trade unions, in her words. And also then she talks about his stoicism, his courage, and the fact that he inspired so many in the way that he reacted and rebuilt his career after, as you were talking about, those bombings in Brighton that left his wife permanently disabled. And then she talks about how he didn't buckle under pressure, he didn't compromise. And clearly she's talking about how she's taking inspiration from that in her own political career. That's what it sounds like to me. And that the nation has lost one of its very best. And then we've also had the likes of Nadhim Zahawi, former Chancellor for the Conservative Party, saying he was a giant of the Conservative politics and Conservative ideals. That's something that keeps coming up, about how close he was to Conservative ideals and ideology. A man who looked after his wife, a man who nurtured and befriended young Conservatives like me, he says. Alex Burghart calls him a titan. Nigel Evans has said he was a giant of a politician who stuck to his principles. He was a huge beacon of light during Thatcher's government. And he says, you served your country with distinction. So an outpouring of gratitude from Conservative big beasts. And really, I think as the morning goes on, we can expect to hear more from the likes of, especially the kind of old guard in the Conservative Party, the likes of Andrew Mitchell, Sir Roger Gale, the father of the house, those who really knew him well.
Perhaps also from Sir John Major, of course, who would have worked much more closely with him. Adam Bolton is still with us. Adam, just take us back, if you can, to the scale of a moment in British politics, in British life, that the 1984 bombing of the Brighton hotel was, where, of course, Margaret Thatcher was one of the targets, but Lord Tebbit was perhaps the most high-profile victim, alongside, of course, his wife, who suffered more from it. And how big a moment that was in British politics?
Well, it was an absolutely massive moment. I was working in the political team for another station, TVAM, and we were covering the party conferences by shooting stuff on camera and then editing it overnight. I was editing at 3 a.m. when the message came through that there had been a bomb attack on the Grand Hotel where the Conservatives were staying. And within the hour, I was on Brighton seafront. I actually saw Norman Tebbit being carried out from the rubble, and was reporting that with our then colleague John Stapleton. And it was an enormous shock. There had been an intermittent IRA mainland bombing campaign since the mid-1970s, but the Brighton bombing, the planning of it, the fact that the bomb was placed near where the Prime Minister was likely to have her suite many weeks before, timed to go off on towards the end of the Conservative Party conference, was a extremely strong and impressive technical operation. Of course, I think 4 people were killed at the time in the Brighton bombing, including Conservative MPs. Mrs. Thatcher wasn't, partly because she was actually outside her bedroom in a bathroom at the time that the bomb went off. And obviously, as people were being dug out of this hotel, which really had been blown up, there was a question as to whether the party conference should go on, but Mrs. Thatcher determined that there would be a meeting on the Friday morning, and expressed her defiance in the face of terrorism, something, of course, Norman Tebbit later expressed himself. Both of them were the supporters of capital punishment, of the death penalty, although, of course, it had been abolished in the UK by the time that the Brighton bombing took place. But I think what we forget, Wilf, is that politics was a much freer, more open business before the Brighton bombing. I mean, I remember being there, and you could basically wander into the Grand Hotel and talk to people, whether you had a pass or a member of the public or not. Now, when we go to party conferences, or indeed when we go to Parliament, there is a ring of steel around the buildings where the politicians are, which obviously creates a division between them and the public, but is essential, not just because of IRA terrorism, which of course came to an end ultimately with the Good Friday Agreement, but also since then we've seen a number of Islamist attacks on politicians. So if you think about Norman Tebbit and Margaret Thatcher, they were politicians who felt much freer engaging with ordinary citizens, partly because they could, and sadly, security reasons, which really started with the Brighton bomb, have put increasing barriers between our senior politicians and actually meeting the public.
Really fascinating perspective, Adam.